Before every Greek ritual, a purification would happen to rid the supplicants of ritual pollution. But what was this pollution? Was it dangerous? And why were the Greeks so concerned with it that entire cities would be purified after battles and such took place there? Let's take a look. Kairete! One of the most misunderstood and misattributed bits of my faith, second only to sacrifice, was ritual pollution. Many people see it like sin, and some later authors spoke of it this way, though they were in the minority. Typically, one type of pollution was kinda like sin, that of agos or divine wrath, but it didn't quite work the way it did in Judaism or Christianity, and the dead weren't punished for it unless they did something so heinous their bodies weren't ritually buried by their kin. So, what is ritual pollution? Well, there were two main types, separate but interrelated. The first is miasma, and was more a product of circumstance in human life than any sort of sin. My friend Comrade, who is one of my mods on my Discord, describes it like a sort of spiritual sweat, and that's not entirely off the mark. Miasma is really hard to define, but Robert Parker, author of the seminal work on the topic Miasma, Pollution and Purification in Early Greek Religion, gives it the following characteristics. 1. It makes a person ritually impure, which means that they're unfit to present offerings to the gods at home altars or temples. 2. It is contagious. 3. It is dangerous. And 4. The danger it presents is not of a secular origin. The main danger from it was that the gods would not witness sacrifices from the miasmic, and may even be said to desert a home during the time that it's polluted until that pollution is purified. Those polluted, especially by a death or birth, as we'll get into later, would avoid major decisions in temples until they received purification. Depending on the source, different purifications were used, and different time periods were required before purification could take place. He delves into the etymology of the word and the way it was used, arguing that miasma was not attributed specifically to objects or behaviors that elicited disgust, because although they could be a problem at rituals, they weren't considered dangerous. The second type was agos, or divine wrath, which was specifically born of one's actions when one broke a sacred rule. Unlike miasma, it wasn't contagious specifically, but could affect you if the god going after the person decided to do so when you were in the vicinity. In other words, if a god sends a tree to fall on someone's roof over agos and you're in the house, you're a bystander but might still get hit. Generally, most forms of agos could only be purified by the divine justice running its course, unlike miasma, which had various purifications that we'll get into later. So how would one get polluted in the first place? We can start with miasma, as it's the simpler and easier of the two to understand, and also more likely for a modern Hellenist to encounter. The first source of miasma was a death occurring in the home. The moment a death occurred, the house in which the person died became polluted. A special vessel of water was placed outside for purification for those visiting and leaving the home, though they were still said to be polluted for 3 days after exiting the house. This water had to come from a different home, as both the hearth fire and water supply of the home where the corpse lay were said to be polluted with miasma. I'll get more into Greek burial rites in a future video, but the important portion here was that 3 days after death and certain rites were performed, the body would be carried out at dawn for a funeral outside the city. Mourners would bathe after the funeral, and a new hearth fire would be started from another house that was unpolluted. Seawater, or water from multiple springs, was sprinkled about the morning after the body was carried out, and 3 to 5 days later the mourners were allowed back into temples and could again make offerings to the gods. Until this time had passed, however, this pollution was considered contagious to all who entered or came into contact with the bereaved. This pollution from death extended along family lines to other close relatives who were expected to visit the home of the bereaved if they were able. The ancient Greeks took the pollution from miasma extremely seriously. If bones or an unmarked grave were unearthed during the development for a home or temple, the area would be purified immediately. If someone killed someone or died in a temple, this would invoke agos, which we'll talk about later. Likewise, if the bereaved refused to bury their kin and perform funerary rites, unless the kin was a traitor or a temple robber, in which case Zeus was said to have abandoned them. The second major source of miasma was birth. After a woman conceived, she was excluded from temples and such for 40 days in case of early miscarriage. After that period, she would be considered extra sensitive to potential pollution and had to take great care not to come into contact with it, though she was at this point expected to visit several temples to make offerings for her future progeny. When the time came to give birth, anyone who came under the same roof as the new baby and mother were considered polluted for 3 days. After 5 days, the infant was carried around the central hearth and introduced to Hestia as a member of the house, and those who assisted with the birth were said to be cleansed of miasma, though the mother and father weren't yet. It's theorized that there was a purification ritual that took place on this day, but there are no surviving records of what it was. 10 days later, the infant would be named, and the mother, assuming she no longer had any post-birth bleeding, was considered to be purified. Human blood was miasmic, and the shedding of it outside of battle invoked agos, except in the case of the monthly menstrual cycle. Curiously, menstrual blood itself was considered horrific by certain authors, but menstruating women weren't considered miasmic. It was a purifying cycle, though of what they don't exactly say. By the way, this doesn't mean that if you happen to cut yourself or something that you are going to invoke Agos. Shedding of blood here generally means something like murder or deliberate injury of another person. Outside of slaves, but again, there's a whole thing about that, and I do not agree with bringing back ancient culture like that. The third category of miasma was intercourse. Now, the Greeks didn't consider intercourse harmful or shameful, or sinful per se. Copulation between a man and his wife was themis, or natural, so it wasn't the shame that made it miasmic. Early laws give entry to a temple the day after nighttime coitus, but required a special ritual washing if it occurred during the morning or a day that a temple was visited. Both men and women were equally polluted by the act, so there wasn't a sexist connotation there. Coitus itself was done away from the hearth at the center of Greek homes, often in darkness, because Hestia was said to be the soul of a hearth and the hearth shouldn't be polluted by the act. Before you could present offerings at the hearth again, according to Hesiod, you had to wash up. It seems the emission of bodily fluids was specifically the source of the pollution, much like the shedding of blood and fluids in birth and the rot fluids that happen in death. For this reason, defecation was also considered miasmic, although only minorly. Being married and having regular relations with one's partner didn't necessarily bar one from priestly service, except for with virgin goddesses like Athena and Artemis, though there were some ceremonies such as the Eleusis, which required abstinence for a certain amount of time before the festival. I'll cover each of these in more detail as I make videos about the festival calendar. Most priests and priestesses in most cities apart from Athens were regular people with normal marital lives, who assumedly would purify themselves with lustral water before entering the temples or work during their tenure. We'll get into lustral water in a bit. Athens had a particular taste for older priests and priestesses, but it doesn't appear to be the norm for all Greek city-states. The fourth source of pollution intersects a bit with agos, and this is murder and manslaughter. The blood of the murdered was said to cling to the hands of the murderer spiritually, which is why many festivals and shrines state that only those with, quote, clean hands, unquote, may enter. Shakespeare played with this a bit when he wrote Macbeth. Out damned spot, indeed. The city itself was said to be polluted when an uncaught murderer runs amok, and will stay so until they're prosecuted. The murderer would pollute any sanctuary they came into contact with, and eventually, out of anger, the gods would start causing crops to fail and city affairs such as war or peace treaties to go awry. Justice was serious business, however. You wouldn't want to catch the wrong person. If the jury convicted the wrong suspect, the real killer would remain at large, and the agos of the avenging spirit and of the gods would continue to plague the city. This was even the case with accidental killings, unless the victim absolved the killer before they died. There were some purification rites for accidental killings that were unavailable for deliberate ones, though they were quite grisly and probably not safe for me to talk about on YouTube. I will state that blood washes away blood, and it was animal blood used for this purpose, and leave it there. If the killer was caught, they would be banished from the city-state or put to death and tossed out unburied. Most of the time, it was banishment, and they could be adopted into a new city-state with a ritual and would be unblemished there. Bloodshed in battle was just able to be washed off, as Ares extended his protection to soldiers fighting one another in war. That said, if the army didn't bury fallen opponents, agos would be invoked, potentially against the entire city. Burial was serious business if you weren't a traitor or a temple robber. What all these sources of miasma have in common, apart from bodily fluids, is that they all have to do with our mortality. We have minds, as the gods do, but we also have bodies, which they generally do not. For this reason, these sources of miasma were considered to separate us from them, as they didn't wish to be polluted by our mortality. Which brings us to agos itself. Intercourse inside of temples was said to bring agos down on a whole family, whether it was willing or not. As was temple robbing, murder, or bloodshed in or out of a temple, especially for sexual or material gain. Broken xenia, the refusal to bury a corpse of a family member or enemy in battle, intercourse on festival grounds, killing somebody protected by the rites of supplication, broken oaths, or the murder of a herald. With the exception of accidental killing, which again has a horrendous ritual that could be used to free one of blood guilt, these things were not seen as easily rectified. The refusal to perform burial rites could be rectified by doing so, and sometimes broken xenia could with supplication to the offended party. But temple robbers, those who got their rocks off in temples, or killed someone in sacred space, or killed someone under Zeus' protection either as a herald, xenos, or supplicant, all were basically screwed the moment they did it. Agos was an overpowering force that would mess up their lives and potentially affect anyone whose path they came across. This would also happen if somebody tried to give an offering of human blood to the gods, though the attestation for this is all kinds of messy. The idea was that if one polluted the gods or their space, that pollution wouldn't stick but would instead rebound as divine wrath. Which begs the question, there are other religions in the world that use blood offerings and offered human sacrifice. Did they invoke agos? The answer appears to be that this only happened if a follower of these faiths, having done these things, approached the Greek gods. So if you worship them, don't go offering your or anyone else's blood anytime soon. All of us have been around a birth, death, intercourse, or have gone to the bathroom a time or two. So how does one rid themselves of pollution? There were a number of ancient purifiers used. The most common was water drawn from a flowing source, sometimes multiple springs. Another was seawater, or water that had salt sprinkled into it with a prayer to Poseidon to make artificial seawater. Burned sulfur could fumigate a particularly polluted area, though it would make your house stink like rotten eggs for a while if you did it in the modern day. Standing water that had a torch or sprig of herb, particularly rosemary, lit from Hestia's flames extinguished in it with a prayer to her for purification was another common purifier. Sometimes salt and lentils were used in the case of illness, thought to be brought on as a concept of agos, though the reasons why this was done have been lost to us. I'd hazard it has something to do with their sacredness to Apollon, who fathered the divine physician Asclepios and had a hand in healing. Blood from animals was said to purify areas, and as I mentioned earlier, could wash the blood off an accidental manslaughterer's hands if a priest or official of high standing was willing to do the ceremony. Animals would be slaughtered and the blood dripped throughout the city after an invasion, and new hearth fires would be drawn from the central hearth of the city-state. If you've seen my video on Cadiz, however, you'll see why this isn't exactly possible to do in the modern day, even if you were to go and buy an animal from a farm or fairground. For the modern Hellenist, unless you live near a source of seawater like I do, the extinguished match, or herb and/or salt and water with a prayer to Poseidon is going to be your best bet for purification. Like our ancient predecessors, it's good to do your prayer and wash your hands and sprinkle yourself with the newly created lustral water before each ritual. Technically, you can make a large amount in advance if you need to. However, I personally like to make it each time as it helps set the stage for ritual. If you've had intercourse recently, a ritual bath or shower with some Epsom or sea salt dissolved in the bath, or in the case of a shower, in a basin and poured over your head at the end, should help purify you of that sort of miasma. If you've stolen from an ancient temple or directly killed someone though, well, I don't know what to tell you. It took a heck of a lot in ancient times to get that off, and you'd likely need to find a priest familiar with Hellenism to get steps to take that might absolve you of your agos. I don't think the majority of my viewership has that problem though, unless there's something that you're not telling me. The 16th and 17th days of each lunar month were set aside for special rites of cleansing, invoking the Kuretes, or the bronze-sounding spirits who guarded Zeus by making a ruckus with bronze instruments whenever he cried. Usually, a bell or other bronze implement is used to make a sound to call them while sprinkling lustral water around the ritual space and cleansing the statues, altar cloths, and other ritual items. In addition, any new item brought into the home for ritual use, such as new statues or votive offerings, would be cleansed using a similar ritual before being presented to the gods. Now, I'd like to cover something really quick. Some people, especially those new to Hellenism, get overly paranoid about miasma and obsessively cleanse themselves to keep themselves pure at all times. This is a little silly in my view. If you're approaching an altar or shrine, a simple sprinkle of lustral water and a hand washing should be all you need, unless you need a shower or bath because of intercourse. As long as you keep regular, decent hygiene and wear clean clothes when presenting your offerings, you should be fine. The key is recognizing and cleansing yourself before approaching the gods. So the book I referenced was fairly expensive when I got it, which is a big part of why I'm so grateful to my monthly patrons. They picked the topic this week in a poll when I was being indecisive, as I often am. There are rewards ranging from early access to my videos for all tiers, to access for my scripts for $5 and up, to a monthly drawing for a special Patreon bonus video done for the $10 and up patrons. The topic picked last month was Hyades and how the Greeks viewed him, and it took a ton of research to find out much about him. He wasn't talked about a ton in mythology outside of Homer. My patrons get access to the bonus video for a whole week before I release it here, and I only charge for 4 videos a month, the bonus vid not included. It's just a thank you for supporting me. I've added links to a coffee and an Amazon wishlist if you want to help out but don't feel comfortable giving a set amount each month. But remember, I'm not demanding that you do so. I'm grateful to anyone who helps me make this info more accessible, but you sticking around to the end like this means the world to me. If you do decide to grab something off the wishlist for me and attach a gift note, I will read off a YouTube appropriate name and message that you use at the start of the video after I get it. If you're new here and liked what you heard or learned something, douse the subscribe button and call the Kuretes with a bell that all may know that the channel has been cleansed. Drop into the comments if you learned something new, or just want to make fun of me for being superstitious if that's your speed. Special thanks to GaelicNox for their channel art. As always, link to their website and Twitter are in the description. And special thanks to my patrons. Books like Miasma and the recent book on the etymology of the concept of hosios, or piety, are way out of my price range normally, and thanks to you, I've been able to get past the scholarly paywall to make these materials available to any who hear the call from the Greek gods, or even are just curious about what those of us who do believe. And remember, we're stronger together.